Ladies and gentlemen, we present you the Belgrade Security Conference Master of Ceremony, Miss Amanda Coakley.
Hello. Hi, good morning everybody. My name is Amanda Coakley and I'm your Master of Ceremony for this year's conference. I'm delighted to welcome you to Belgrade. So who am I? I am a writer mainly for Foreign Policy magazine, and I cover Central and Eastern Europe, and I'm also an IWM Europe's Futures Fellow in Vienna. So, as I said, I'm delighted to welcome you. The title of our conference is Authoritarianism as a Cause of War and a Duty to Resist. Now, of course, that's an incredibly huge topic, but I think that today nuanced conversations really matter, and honest conversations matter. And I think the depth of this conference really shows all the different things that we have to address. And over the next 2 days, we're going to be talking about Russia's war in Ukraine, the future of the EU, democracy and authoritarianism, the green energy transition, human rights, cybersecurity. So I really hope that you take something away that really adds to your work going forward, and that you can meet people and have conversations outside of the panels as well that will benefit you. So, on with the conference. So this year's conference is dedicated to Voyan Dmitrievich, and he was a long-time human rights campaigner here in Belgrade. And he passed away 10 years ago, and we'd like to remember him and his work. So now there'll be a brief video, and I hope you enjoy it, and please keep him in your thoughts throughout the next 2 days. Thank you very much.
Svi vidovi diskriminacije imaju jedan zajednički imenitelj. Svi se oni svode na to da se prema nekome ophodimo ovako ili onako. Ne zbog onoga što on ili ona jeste, zbog njegovih ili njenih zasluga ili prestupa, već zbog njegove ili njene pripadnosti određene grupi, za koju se vezuju određeni stereotipi. Ako se prema pojedincu odnosimo kao prema individualnoj ličnosti, i to ne samo u individualnim odnosima, već na jednoj opštoj, više ravni, i ako mediji, predstavnici svih nivoa vlasti, javne ličnosti i mnogi drugi počnu da se ponašaju tako, načinili smo prvi korak na putu tolerancije i tolerisanja.
Kod nas nema pravne države. Nije ni čudo da posle tolikih godina preziranja prava da postoji nakazna predstava o pravnoj državi. Ono što se kod nas vrlo režeći uvek kaže sad će da deluje pravna država, to je zapravo jedna država koja pendrekom i drugim sredstvima sprovodi samovolju onoga koji ima prava da komanduje takvim snagama.
Vi imate recimo medije koji su jedna od velikih sila nekontrolisanih u našem društvu, gde se ljudsko dostojanstvo gazi kako se hoće, bez ikakvih posledica.
Mi se vraćamo u tu hipernacionalnu državu, a trudio sam se da gledam ustave, jer ustavi su jedina stvar koju ti režimi ne mogu da poreknu. Jer ako kažete nešto drugo, oni mi kažu nije tačno. Lažna propaganda, čitali ste pogrešnu štampu, ustav je napisan, tu stoji.
Mi imamo jedan teži slučaj lustracije nego drugi. Verovatno će takav slučaj imati Uzbekistan, Tadžikistan i tako dalje. Jer treba lustrirati, ove sve ostale su bile protiv bivše takozvane bolševičke komunističke vlasti, jer da što je na neki način jednostavnije, a mi smo morali da u isto vremeno obavimo lustraciju i te vlasti i ove koju je navodno zamenila. I naravno, pošto bi to pogodilo ljude koji su bili vrlo važni i u jednoj i u drugoj vlasti i koji su kao što smo videli, od staljinista postali preko noći nacionalisti, onda je otpor toliko veći. To je počelo od Hitlera i njegovog sistema, da su neke strašne stvari bile dozvoljene. I onda imate tu takozvanu tranzicijonu pravdu, kako ćete kazniti ljude koji su učinili nepodopštine, da vređali sam duh prava, zato što i navodno i vlada i vlasti dopuštali da to rade, a da ne povredite njihova prava. Ilustracija se svodi ni na kakvu kaznu, nego na sprečavanje da u vrhovne organe vlasti jedno vreme ne dođu neki ljudi koji su pokazali svojim radom da nisu dostojni toga. Šta više, ako ih je narod birao, kao što su narodni poslanici, onda je jedina mera da se opomenu birači da znaju koga biraju.
Smatrao sam, kao i mnogi drugi, da čovek koji javno istupa mora u trenucima koje smatra opasnim i sudbonosnim činiti sve što može da spreči ili oteža najgore ishode, koristeći bar zdrav razum.
Ljudi jeste grosso modo rade za interes, ali dođu trenuci kada nastane jedna masovna iracionalnost indukovana nekako demagogijom, potrebom, znate, tim uverenjem o žrtvi, o tome da smo, ne znam, dobili u ratu, gubili u miru, šta sve to tako. I sada prosto obični ljudi mi smo čudna zemlja gde je, kako bih rekao, običan narod inteligentniji od elite.
In 1989, he removed Kosovo's autonomy, turning the province's Albanian majority into second-class citizens.
Let's face it, he enjoyed a tremendous sport, and of course people were not aware for a number of years initially that this was leading to bloodshed, that this was leading to crimes, that this country will be totally isolated.
Krajem ove nedelje znači u petak, a danas je ponedelja.
Ljudi su gadljivi na politiku i pošto su gadljivi, samo im se sveti. Bavit će se politikom oni koji nisu gadljivi. Ne krivem toliko šarlatane ili neznalice, jer oni to zbilje i ne znaju. Verovatno onaj naš lingvista koji nam je stalno pisao da u Americi ne sme da se govori drugčije nego engleski, da se odmah apse ljudi koji govore drugčije, verovatno on to ne zna. Ali znam veliki broj ljudi koji znaju, ali govore drugčije. I mislim da se oni veliki krivci za ovo zlo su davali, kako se to nekad govorilo, naučnu podlogu za ovo sve.
Ovde izgleda ne postoji konsensus ili je stvoren desetogodišnjom propagandom da je ubiti čoveka zločin. Samo nekoga ubiti. Ubiti ne Srbina, a Boga mi i ubiti Srbina.
Kad su me optuživali da nemam nacionalni osjećaj, odgovarao sam i odgovaram da ga itekako imam. Odgovaram to na jeziku koji najbolje znam, na srpskom, pa se često u tim prepucavanjima ispostavi da je moj srpski mnogo bolji od srpskog onih koji me za nesrpstvo optužuju.
Samim protekom vremena sve idu u zaborav. Kao što vidite iz tog istog istraživanja, zaboravljaju se i zločini nad Srbima. To je jedna prirodna potreba da ne mislimo o tome i to vam je taj eskapizam koji vlada na svim našim medijima, ajde da mislimo o nečem drugom. Prema tome nema šanse ako se nešto ne promeni. Jedino što može se promeni to je da naša intelektualna i politička elita počne drugčije da govori. Jer znaš šta, ljudi govore ovo što im je 1000 puta u 15 godina rečeno, pa rat je rat, pa u ratu svi ubijaju, pa mi smo najveća žrtva, pa mi smo se branili i tako dalje. Nije to stiglo spontano dosta. To je jedan plod jednog sistematskog indoktriniranja, ponavljanja, koji naravno leže na jednu potrebu ljudi da, šta ja znam, njegov rođak, njegov sunarodnik, njegova okolina, verujemo da nije kriv, pa svi ćemo u porodici pretpostavimo da naše dete, naš brat nije to učinio.
Ono što se ovde desilo, desilo se
prevashodno našom zaslugom, i to pretežno zaslugom ovih iz Beograda, jedne koalicije staljinista, socijalista i srpskih nacionalista koji su možda mislili da će da izigraju jedne druge, ali obično izigra drugoga onaj koji ima medije, koji ima policiju, koji ima vojsku, a to je imao Milošević. Pošto se Međunarodnom sudu pravde može prići samo putem genocida, onda se svi sile da dokažu ono što se desilo da je genocid. I paradoks je da sad kad to počinje da se radi, kad postoje ozbiljni sporazumi između tužilaštava i tako dalje, mi ostajemo na toj jednoj tužbi i protiv tužbi koje su zapravo uslovljene procesno, uslovljene potrebom da se nešto proglasi za genocid, da bi se dobio forum pred Međunarodnim sudom u Hagu, što više nije potrebno i što naravno izaziva neke reminiscencije iz prošlosti koje bi svi želeli da ne da zaboravimo, nego da prevaziđemo.
Humor i ironija su znak pameti i skromnosti onoga koji iznosi neku tvrdnju. On time pokazuje da je uveren da se služi najboljim argumentima, ali da njih odvaja od sebe, jer ne misli da je nepogrešiv i da nema neku, bar sitnu manu. Ako je takav, sagovornici ga primaju kao ljudsko biće, sa simpatijama ili razumevanjem koji odatle proističu. U suprotnom, njegova uobraženost se postepeno pretvara u ograničenost, a njegove patetične tvrdnje sve su neumesnije.
Policija uvek žmuri na desno oko. Njoj se uvek više smeta levica u svim zemljama u desnici. Gledajte šta je bilo sa našim jadnim šakom takozvanih anarhista. Oni su odkreketali u istražnom zatvoru koliko, 6-8 meseci, zbog jedne štete napada na grčku ambasadu, gde i sama grčka ambasada nije podržala gonjenje i rekla to košta, ne znam, 15 evra. Međutim, oni su držani to jer ta odijum prema toj levici kod nas postoji i to su drugi razlici. Tako da ovo sve što nabrate, to je desno. Odlučujuće snage koje podržavaju vladu sadašnju Srbije ili mrze ili preziru nevladine organizacije iz raznih razloga i smatraju možda i štetnim. Neki zato što smatraju da osim države ne treba nikoga da bude, ne shvataju da je društvo komplikovanije, da je suviše komplikovano da bi samo država ga vodila, a neki jednostavno se prenosi ta mržnja iz radnijeg perioda, tako da kad god treba maltretirati nevladine organizacije, one se maltretiraju. Čak i ako to ne piše u zakonu, da imate uvek mrzovoljne službenike koji to rade i pritom se pod nevladinim organizacijama tim lošim smatraju samo one koji se bave ljudskim pravom i demokratijom. Niko ne dira u one najnazadnije, ima puno vrlo problematičnih, kako bih rekao, moralno nevladinih organizacija, ima direktno reakcionarni upotrebu intervju, niko njih ne dira. Zadivljuje me jedna naša rusofilija koja ima neke obrise, zato je kompetentniji Žarko Korać, ima neke obrise prave ljubavi. Jedna ljubav između muškarca i žene, gde vi onda kad vidite nešto loše na onom drugom ili vam neko kaže, vi to nekako racionalizujete da prevladate. Nju vole svi. Vole je i bivši komunisti, vole je i infarbirovci, vole je i dražinovci, vole je i komunisti i antikomunisti, i monarhisti i republikanci, zato što svi oni u njoj vide nešto što je njima slično,
nešto što su
njima
možda izgubili
odgovara.
od svojih želja ovde.
A drugo, onda naravno s druge strane, ruska diplomatija bi trebalo da bude luda da to ne iskoristi.
Mi se ponašamo kao da sve treba da nam plati što smo glasali 24. što smo 5. odborili diktaturu, kao da smo mi tu demokratiju i vladavinu nekog reda učinili da bi učinili strancima.
Država mora da štiti i one koji demonstriraju i one koji pokušavaju da kontrademonstriraju, zato što sloboda izražavanja i iznošenja svojih gledišta nije obojena ideološki.
Lako je biti fanatičan u odbrani ekstrema, ali se ne može biti fanatično tolerantan.
First of all, I'd just like to thank the people that put that beautiful video together. I know as a former TV news producer the amount of work that goes into a memorial video like that, so thank you very, very much. One thing that I really took away from that video was Voyan Dmitrievich's comment, talking about the dangers of this thinking that we lost in peace but won in war. And when you look at Vladimir Putin's Russia today and how basically the politics of memory has been used, especially the Second World War, and the dangers that that thinking has brought up, is really something amazing that he was talking about this years and years ago, albeit in a different context. So anyway, moving on, I'd like to introduce Igor Bandovic, the director of the Belgrade Center for Security Policy. Thank you.
Dear guests, in June, when we received the news that our long-time partners were withdrawing from the joint project of the Belgrade Security Forum, the BCSP team faced a big dilemma, whether to continue organizing the conference or give up on such an important but demanding organizational and logistical venture that we jointly planned for 11 years. Although initially planned as a major obstacle, BCSP team decided to continue. We decided to continue with the conference because Serbia, its foreign policy, its security policy, needs it. Because it is necessary for the Western Balkans region, and because it is necessary for Europe to have such conference in Belgrade. Serbia needs it because it presents an honest, eye-opening alternative to provincial and malicious interpretation of world events. The Balkan needs it because of the regional stability, its European future, and new way of looking at our old problems. Europe needs it because it will be one of the few forces where key pan-European debates can be conducted in this country. We cannot remain Balkan-centric. We can no longer afford to look at the world through the prism of our own problems, just as we shouldn't be cynical about human suffering anywhere, coldly calculating or not taking a humanitarian stand when it pays off. That's why with this year's conference, precisely, we are focusing on Ukraine, the causes and its consequences. All the doubts, challenges, and obstacles in the Balkans become obsolete in the face of the new danger. An aggressive war waged against the sovereign state only because it aspired to join the European Union and the NATO. Authoritarianism is the same in all parts of the world. Although it's sometimes very hard for external observers to see. Authoritarianism can never be good. In its final stage, authoritarianism will lead to war, suffering, and innocent victims. It's simply a matter of time. And when this becomes evident, it's too late. With these thoughts in mind, we have compiled a program for Belgrade Security Conference this year, focusing on authoritarianism as a cause of war. That is why we have invited human rights defenders from Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia to address us at this conference. It is our great pleasure in BCSP and all its partners and conference organizers to honor and to receive this year's Nobel laureates. We admire their struggle for democracy and for freedom. For the same reason, we dedicate this year's conference to our mentor and professor, Vojin Dmitrievich, who spent his whole life fighting against dictatorship, war crimes, autocracy, and for human rights. This October marks the 10th year of his passing away. This year also, we encourage our partner organizations with whom we share the same values to have their own panel discussions within the conference, and they will address the topics which are specific to their areas of work. Misinformation, fake news, the topic of human rights defenders, and the issue of EU enlargement in specific circumstances imposed by the war. Energy security and Europeans' new security architecture will also be discussed. We will close the conference with a key and the current topic of the region, the relationship between Kosovo and Serbia, and we will host Kosovo Deputy Prime Minister Besnik Bislimi. We believe that if the goal of the Serbia-Kosovo negotiations is to normalize relations, such a visit should be a common occurrence of improving relations between Pristina and Belgrade. We hope that both Serbian and Kosovo authorities will encourage and appreciate these kinds of mutual visits, especially when organized by civil society organizations. Finally, I would like to thank all our donors and partner organizations. They have recognized the work of the BCSP for many years and decided to join us for this special and unique opportunity. I wish you all 2 days of great discussions, new insights, and thoughtful talks. I hope this event will inspire greater determination to make the Balkans and Europe more democratic, more secure, and more safe. Thank you.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, since the Russian aggression against Ukraine started on 24th of February, the Kremlin and local anti-Western narrative prevails in most of the daily press, as well as the Serbian media under control of the government. Because of this, and a decade-long daily drip of anti-Western propaganda from government-affiliated tabloids and TVs, the majority of the Serbian population has only been able to hear one side of the story. It is, to say the least, confused when it comes to what's happening in Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. The Kremlin's disinformation efforts have also been successful in poisoning the public opinion and the public discourse in other Western Balkans countries. The unofficial motto of the new Belgrade Security Conference is duty to listen to the other side. We at the Belgrade Center for Security Policy oppose authoritarianism, value democracy, and believe in the sanctity of international law. For such reasons, we are honored to present this year's Nobel Prize laureates from Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. For many years, all three organizations have promoted the right to criticize power, document war crimes, document human rights abuses, and protect the fundamental rights of citizens. Together, these laureates demonstrate the significance of civil society's struggle for peace and democracy. The Center for Civil Liberties was founded in Kyiv in 2007 for the purpose of advancing human rights and democracy in Ukraine. The center has taken a stand to strengthen Ukrainian civil society and pressure the authorities to make Ukraine a fully fledged democracy. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Center for Civil Liberties engaged in efforts to identify and document Russian war crimes against the Ukrainian civilian population. This is why we are honored to have with us Alexandra Matvichuk, representing the Ukrainian human rights organization Center for Civil Liberties. I would like to say on behalf of us, the organizers of this conference, and I assume most of the people attending it, Lesia, we stand with Ukraine.
We have documented over 21,000 episodes of war crimes. And sometimes I have a very clear understanding that we document the pure human pain. Russia uses the war crimes as the methods of warfare. Russian military intentionally ruins residential dwellings, churches, hospitals, schools, critical civil infrastructure. Russians facilitate filtration camp system and commit massive deportation of Ukrainian population. Russian army terrorizes civilians, aiming to keep its control over the occupied territories. They abduct, torture, rape, and kill people. So I would like to say several words about global security, which now lays in ruins as Ukrainian Mariupol. Global security is the most difficult challenge since the Second World War. We live in a world where the permanent member of the UN Security Council unleashes the war of aggression, and as a result, a Russian rocket kills a journalist in Kyiv accurately upon the visit of the UN Secretary General. The whole system of peace and security has failed for months, for years, to stop Russian atrocities. And it's important to understand why. Militaries are speaking now because civil society voices have not been heard before. Maybe we, as a human rights defenders, were heard at the UN Committee on Human Rights or at the HDIM OSCE, but not in the rooms where decisions are made by the people in power. If we do not want to live in a world where power is stay only with those who have the stronger military, civil society voices need much more support. First, the connection between peace, progress, and human rights is inextricable. That was evident for the Soviet dissidents in the Helsinki movement. Human rights and the rule of law are a matter of common security, just as important as the military potential or economic stability. Second, we can no longer afford to separate and marginalize the human dimension. The state that systematically disregards human rights obligations persecute lawyers, journalists, human rights defenders, is a security threat for the entire region. Third, only the strong civil society matters can resist launching an aggressive war. You cannot stop the aggressor with reports of litigations. Human rights are lost if left to diplomats, lawyers, or experts. Human rights education and awareness among the population should become a priority. And last, this is not the war of two states, Russia and Ukraine. This is the war of two systems, authoritarianism and democracy. If we do not stop Putin in Ukraine, he will go further. Ukraine needs all kinds of support from the civilized world because our world is very interconnected and only the spread of freedom makes our world safer. Thank you.
Vyasna from Belarus was founded in 1996 in response to the controversial constitutional amendments that gave the Belarus president dictatorial powers, triggering widespread demonstrations. Vyasna provided support for jailed demonstrators and their families. In the following years, Vyasna evolved into a broad-based human rights organization that documented and protested against the authorities' torturing of political prisoners. Government authorities in Belarus have repeatedly sought to silence the organization's founder, Ales Bialyatsky. He was first imprisoned from 2011 to 2014. In 2020, following large-scale demonstrations against the regime, he was again arrested. He remains in jail without trial. Despite tremendous personal hardship, Mr. Bialyatsky remains resolute in his fight for human rights and democracy in Belarus. We honor his struggle, and we are honored to have Vladimir Vyalichkin from Vyasna to talk about their common fight for freedom and democracy. Having endured a similar experience during the 1990s dictatorship of Slobodan Milosevic, we in the Belgrade Center for Security Policy also stand with Mr. Bialyatsky, Vyasna, and our friends from the civil society of Belarus.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Quite recently, the Norwegian Nobel Committee decided to award the Peace Prize for the protection of human rights the Belarusian human rights activist Ales Bialyatsky, chairman of the Human Rights Center Vesna. Ales Bialyatsky has promoted the right to criticize authority and protected the fundamental rights of citizens over the years. He has made outstanding efforts in documenting war crimes, human rights violations, and abuses of power. He has proven the importance of the civil society for peace and democracy in Belarus. A press release from the United Nations Human Rights Committee noted the attempts by the Belarusian authorities to make Bialyatsky be silent, and yet it does not retreat an inch in the fight for human rights and democracy in Belarus. It is really so. Nobel laureate Ales Bialyatsky was arrested last year following street protests against the regime. Not only Ales, but also 6 more members of Vesna pay for democracy ideas with their freedom and health, as well as hundreds of thousands of repressed citizens for trying to overthrow the dictatorship and restore democratic order. Members of the Human Rights Center Vesna continue to be held in the pretrial detention center on arbitrary charges. 2 vice chairmen of our organization, Valentin Stefanovich and Vladimir Lapkovich, coordinator of the Vesna volunteer service, Marfa Rabkova, and the volunteer Andrei Chapuk. They were sentenced to 15 and 6 years in prison. Human rights activists of Vesna Brest branch, Sergei Petrukhin, was sentenced to 3 years of correctional colony. Member of the Human Rights Center Vesna Leonid Sudalenko was sentenced to 3 years. His colleague Tatiana Lasitsa was sentenced to 2 years and 6 months in prison. On the 11th of August, the investigation committee reported that from August 2020, 11,000 criminal cases of an extremist orientation were opened in Belarus against civil activists. By the 1st of October, there were several thousand civil activists in places of detention. 1,324 of them are recognized now as political prisoners. Human rights activists continue to recognize numerous facts of ill treatment against citizens deprived of their liberty for political reasons, detained and subjected for administrative arrest for participating in peaceful assemblies. The inhuman conditions of detention for this category of detainees, deliberately created by the administration of various places of deprivation of liberty, are regarded as torture. The aggressive war unleashed by the Russian Federation in Ukraine has been going on for more than 8 months, in which the aggressor troops located on the territory of Belarus are involved, and the Belarusian infrastructure is used. The Human Rights Center Vesna strongly condemned the actions of the Belarusian and Russian authorities, which undermine the foundations of peaceful coexistence, violate the constitution and laws of Belarus, as well as the provisions of international treaties. The Nobel Peace Prize for Les Belatsky, the Russian Memorial, and the Ukrainian Center for Civil Liberties serves as a reminder to the governments around the world that the hallmark of successful and stable democracies is the existence of a strong and freely functioning civil society. Thank you.
The Human Rights Organization Memorial was established in 1987 by human rights activists in the former Soviet Union who wanted to ensure that the victims of the oppressive communist regime would never be forgotten. Memorial is based on the notion that confronting past crimes is essential for preventing new ones. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Memorial grew to become the largest human organization in Russia. Memorial's activity continued during the Chechen Wars. Some of Memorial's employees were killed because of their work. For years, civil society actors in Russia are victims of threats, imprisonment, disappearance, and murder. In December 2021, Putin's regime ordered Memorial to cease and desist, but its people refused to give up. We are proud to have one of them with us, Anastasia Garina, Executive Director of the Human Rights Organization Memorial. Anastasia, we in the Belgrade Center for Security Policy also stand with Russian civil society in their struggle for freedom and democracy.
Thank you so much. Good morning. Then I began to speak. I understand that people usually expect some answers for their questions, but I'm afraid we don't still have any, just statements. The first statement is that we came to the very dark page of our history. I mean, Russia itself, and probably the whole world, because Russia tries to drag the whole world with it now. Probably it's obvious here on the conference, but still it's not obvious for the people in different countries inside of Russia and outside. And it's a problem, of course, because I believe that, and hopefully we are in the beginning of the process, so it will be worse. the second statement, that what happened didn't happen unexpectedly one day. Just it wasn't the morning when we woke up and find ourselves in non-democratic country. We have different periods of our history, and in the end of Soviet era, then our organization was founded. There appeared some freedoms, freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. And after the respect for human rights gradually formed in the country. But it didn't last for long. Step by step, every day. Sometimes it was a big step, sometimes it was a very small step, but it was in every field, and it was the way down and down and down and down. So now there is no freedom of speech in Russia, and you can't just say the things that are obvious for the people all over the world, but in Russia you can be jailed for that. There is no freedom of assembly, and still, of course, people try to protest, but it never helps. Now it's too late to do that, probably. People are kidnapping, murdered, tortured, and I'm afraid that there is no any limits for it now. So that's why I'm talking that probably it will be worse. The first statement is that we were the civil society and the activists, human rights defenders, we were unable to resist this process. So it was step by step, but we couldn't stop it. And first of all, I think now it's very difficult to say for many people, but probably, I think, it happened because we didn't pay enough attention to it. So of course, we see that processes inside the country are not okay, but probably we didn't really believe how serious are this process. How propaganda, then it appeared, it didn't appear suddenly. We have a free press many years ago, but then it became not really free, and the propaganda appeared. It appeared many years ago, and at first, then we heard of some weird statements from the TV set, from the news. We just think, okay, I personally think that, okay, it's really weird, but who will believe it? It's just no one. Because of course there are some people in every country, in every time, there are some people who believe in conspiracy theories, to UFO, to some fake information about whatever it is, but it's not a big percent of population. And there is always such a people, but no, it was not like that. It's not only for UFO believers. Now, in the very weird things, millions of people believe. So, of course, probably if we understood how it works before it came to this very point, probably we could do something. And the last statement is that this position that we don't pay enough attention, this position is not only Russian characteristic. I see people now all over the world, they say, even human rights defenders they believe that something wrong is with Russian society, so it can't be in another country, in another society, that people all over the world were just let Putin and regime to do what they want, but they miss that it's not only to let him do. It's about million people, not only in Russia, still believe in propaganda, still believe that it's not just let him do for money. It's about believe him. It's about believe those statements. It's about believe that we don't need human rights, but we need a strong state that can. I don't know, but I don't know what is the reason to have a strong state, but many people still believe in it, and we need to remember that when we are talking about supporting the Russian regime, it's not only about supporting it for money. It's not only about the economical reasons. Many people still believe that it's okay, and this is the great problem, not only about Russia and Russian society. It's a great problem for the whole world. Thank you.
Recording stop.
Okay, so we're just going to move on to the first panel now because unfortunately Alexei Reznikov cannot join us this morning. He called, his schedule has changed. So we hope that we can get him up at another time, but unfortunately he can't speak to us now. So our first panel is Ukraine under attack, how the war in Ukraine has unfolded, what this will mean for the Ukrainian nation going forward and its sense of identity, and can we begin to look towards a post-war future, or is it too soon? And speaking to us about this is Haleb Vishlinsky, Liliana Filipchuk, Maria Zolkina, Mikhailo Samis, and Iskra Kirova. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Belgrade Center for Security Policy for this invitation. It's a real humbling experience to be here and to have the opportunity to moderate this very important discussion that I think will also set the scene for a lot of what we'll discuss over the next 2 days. I'd like to dive right into our panel. We've already heard a lot, and maybe just to take a closer look at where things stand now on the ground and with recent political developments. Over the last 2 months, the war has entered in a new phase with the announced so-called partial mobilization in Russia, which then proceeded to annex through sham referenda territories under its occupation, particularly the regions of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. This then was followed by horrific airstrikes on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure and cities, wreaking much havoc. And we have also, in the last months, heard Putin's yet most explicit nuclear threats. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn to Maria Zolkina and ask you, Maria, how is this escalation perceived from Ukraine, and what does it tell us about the course of the war right now?
Thank you, Iskra. Good morning to everyone, and thank you for organization of this very important both conference on the one hand and panel on the other hand. So speaking from what is going on the ground, I would say that what world has really to understand about Ukraine is that Ukrainians are very united in terms of their belief that Ukraine will win this war, and public opinion polls which we succeed to conduct even in the times of ongoing aggression against Ukraine prove that. 90% of Ukrainians right now believing that Ukraine will win this war and believe that Ukraine should not concede or surrender any inch of its territory. At the same time, it explains why we have all these, let's say, attempts to repel Russia's attacks in Donbas, and we are succeeding in that. So basically right now, the front line is still not stable, but we understand what is going on where. We need to understand that Russia has fully failed with its even one of the modest Russian goals to capture Donbas. They don't have any prospects to capture Donetsk region, and they have stuck completely along the front line, which they reached at the beginning of the summer. Moreover, Ukraine has returned the control over a very important Kharkiv region, started liberating the Luhansk region, which is my native region, for instance. And at the same time, we are conducting a bit slower, but still counteroffensive in Kherson region. It's different from the rapid, efficient counterattack which Ukraine demonstrated to the whole world when it came to the Kharkiv region recently, but in Kherson it's still very well-planned and sophisticated operation, moving even with, let's say, smaller steps, but moving forward. So when it comes to the price of the victory, it means that for Ukrainian side, we understand that the price will be high in terms of destruction, in terms of life of our people, but we don't see any other way to win this war, because the elimination of Ukrainian state, elimination of Ukrainian nation, we perceive it as a genocidal war against Ukraine. And even the severe attacks on critical infrastructure, I mean energy and power plants all over Ukraine, we perceived it as the attempt to make Ukrainian people freeze, to make Ukrainian people be deprived of basic needs, because not just schools or buildings will be without electricity in case these attacks are continued, but people in hospitals will be not served in a proper way, let's say. So we are considering it as a genocide, and both on practical and legal level, Ukraine has started already processing this issue. I mean, Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Justice are pushing this issue for international negotiations and for international institutions in order to make Russia be responsible for that. I mean, for establishing of international tribunals. When it comes to the basic interest of the sides, let's say, when for us, it's not just to liberate our territory, but to make Russia not be able to attack Ukraine in 1 year, in half of the year, of formal or not formal end of this very war. So it's very important to make Russia be not simply capable of another aggression, and that's why the ideas of so-called temporary or formal ceasefire, which are being more and more pushed by Russia since the mid of summer, and maybe we will talk about that later. Yes, we perceive it just as a threat to Ukraine, and I can elaborate later.
Yes,
but
yes.
basically, what we see now: consolidation of Ukrainian society, support to authorities and to the army. This, I would say, this is maybe the first moment in Ukrainian history when there is a full consensus between NGOs, between society, wide public generally, and authorities about how Ukrainian policy should look like. It's about repelling Russian attack and liberating Ukrainian territories, including Crimea and previously occupied part of the Donbas.
Thank you, Maria, and we'll get also into more detail later on, both on the negotiations and Ukrainian attitudes. I want to turn to Mikhailo now and just ask more specifically about Ukraine's military resilience at the moment. So Ukraine has coped well with positional war, has made some successes with counteroffensive, particularly in the east, not so much in the south, but it is more vulnerable in terms of air defense. And then there's winter coming as far as the ground war is concerned and all the challenges that Ukraine and the Ukrainian army will face. How do you assess Ukraine's military resilience at this moment?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me here. And traditionally, I'd like to thank to Ukrainian soldiers who are fighting just now on the battlefield, to men and women who are actually protecting us. And we can be here on this beautiful city when Russian aggressors attacking Ukrainian territory. Talking about the military picture, I would say that I think Maria described the situation, and actually your question had an answer. Why Russia started to make these nuclear fake operations, like dirty bombs? Why Russia started to this annexation? Why Russia started this so-called mobilization? Because they totally lost on battlefield. In reality, Ukrainian armed forces already defeated professional Russian army. They doesn't exist now. So now they started to recruit criminals. They started to recruit by mobilization normal people. It's not the soldiers. They are just normal people who believed Putin somehow. Or maybe they don't believe Putin, but living in this dictatorship, they need to go to die because of Putin ideas. And this is the reality of this war on current moment, that even we're talking about winter, for Putin in reality, now the main task here and a goal on the battlefield, to stop Ukrainian armed forces, which is continuing the offensive operation on south and east, and do not allow Ukrainians to deliberate new lands, to freeze this situation till the spring, because these genocide missile strikes, you remember a couple of weeks ago, they started to make hundreds of missile strikes, especially to civilian infrastructure. No military, I underline, no military objects, only energy, only electricity, only the heating facilities in Ukrainian cities to organize, I call it Holodomor. We had a Golodomor, but now they're trying to organize another genocide, Holodomor. Like, I think in Serbian language, Holod, Hlad, it's the same like in Ukrainian. So it's to freeze Ukrainian people, they started to protest against Zelensky, because one of the main myths of Russian propaganda that Zelensky is extremist, Nazist, but Ukrainian people just under the influence of this Nazist ideology. But Maria told 90% of Ukrainians, they are not a zombie. They just want to be free. They just want to live in normal country, in democratic world, in normal economy, to make business, to live in comfortable conditions, and have a self-development for their children in normal, civilized, not like in Russia. We understood, I heard the Prize Nobel laureate she told that we didn't recognize that Putin so dangerous for Russia. We recognize this very, very easy. When Yanukovych arrived to the office, we recognized this is Putin. Putin methods, Putin technologies. And that's why we push out Yanukovych, do not allow them to build Russia in Ukraine. It was 2013, 2014. And that's why Putin decided to start the war in 2014. In 2024, it was a new escalation. So talking about the battlefield, I think the main forecast, Putin will try to freeze the situation because he thinks that time playing for him, because we'll try to organize this crazy bad winter for Ukraine and Europe, of course. He's dreaming about the energy crisis in Europe, and that's why he's trying to stop Ukrainian offensive operations. But I think he will get opposite, because when, after this massive missile and Iranian drone strikes against civilian infrastructure, we have even more intentions to go forward and to liberate our land.
Thank you, Mikhailo, for this picture of Ukraine's determination. Very important to start from that. And I want to still look at what's happening on the ground and in the east, and turn to Liliana. So these annexed territories, to control them, Russia will need to have people there on its side. Is that working right now? Of course, here's where the question of deportation and forced displacement comes in. Can you give us an assessment of these tactics and how effective are they?
Yeah, for what I can say for sure is that these tactics were in force long centuries ago. I mean that Russian Empire and then the USSR have been using these tactics for longer period of times by deporting people and by using force in order to create the more the society who would actually be able to believe in the propaganda what was spread on that times. But I would say it's not, now it's more like a black box in terms of the numbers of people who've been deported and in terms of the conditions of the process. We know only some data which is coming from Russian Federation itself, and we don't know if there is a possibility to trust in this data. Also, Ukrainian civil society organizations are in danger in occupied territories, and by the occupied territories I mean the territories of Crimea and Donbass and newly occupied territories as well. There have been some casualties already among the civil society activists, and they are in danger, like it's a priority for the occupiers to captivate these people and to make them not capable of any of anything. Also, I would like to say that now Ukrainian society has been showing so much resilience over what have been happening, and for now. It's interesting to see that local governments and so municipalities and grassroots organizations are actually taking care and assisting a lot of IDPs, internally displaced people, and people affected by the war. It's pretty obvious now that in the beginning of full-scale invasion, it was very supported by the general public, and a lot of people were engaged into helping the IDPs, assisting them in the hosting communities. But now, when it is prolonged, protracted conflict, and when it's enduring, now some initiatives are growing and expanding. They are actually now more like projects that can show some durable solutions. When we talk, for example, in terms of providing housing, and when we talk about the providing employment opportunities. It's I can bring like many examples from every region of Ukraine. Now, currently I am based in Ivano-Frankivsk region, and it showed that the local government is very much interested in helping businesses to move to this region and to employ the people who come in. Also, the idea of the internally displaced person in Ukraine has changed already, because in the previous phase of people influx, when it was 2014, 2015, the IDPs were seen as vulnerable people who cannot help themselves and who just demand something. It was a general idea, and sometimes in some regions there were, I would not say conflicts, but like possibilities of conflicts. Now, in this stage, it has changed totally, and the idea of the person who is forced to move to another part of Ukraine or is forced to move to neighboring countries is changing greatly, and it is again has to do more with Ukrainian resilience and with our trust in ourselves.
So you are painting a very positive picture of the resilience of Ukrainian society and dealing with the IDP issue. But we also know that a lot of people might be displaced this winter. The World Health Organization has come out with some figures, 2 to 3 million people might be displaced. And of course, many might just have to leave their homes simply because of lack of heating. So there are quite some urgent needs. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree that the needs are really critical, and I maybe forgot to mention that now civil society organizations are dealing with that in cooperation with local governments, and it's like the leadership, what is going on, and the central government is more of consulting, supporting, providing general framework for the process, but the local governments are now capable of doing more for the assistance of IDPs. And it's also important to mention that this is possible. I mean, the resilience is possible, of course, thanks to the international organizations and donors who've been helping Ukraine to overcome some problems with resources. And yes.
Thank you. We'll come to that question of how Ukraine's Western partners are supporting it right now. But I also would like to bring in our colleague Gleb, who is joining us online, and to continue talking actually about the resilience of the Ukrainian state after all the economic and other damage it has suffered. So just in the 2 weeks since the 10th of October, when airstrikes intensified, we've seen some data that over 400 infrastructure facilities have been severely damaged in about 16 regions of Ukraine. About 1/3 of Ukraine's power supply has been severely affected. Can you give us a picture of the impact of all the damage and destruction that Ukraine has suffered? And also, as a second follow-up question, how do you see Ukraine being able to cope in the next months, and again, particularly with the onset of winter?
Yeah, thank you. What we see now is that these attacks resulted in a decline in electricity consumption of approximately 10%. And generally, in the worst scenario, it could significantly increase the decline in Ukrainian economy this year. Like while currently, general expectations are that Ukrainian economy will decrease by 30 to 35% this year, like with central estimate of like 32, 33. Then like the worst scenario is additional 5 to 6% percentage points of GDP decline this year, and next year turning from expected growth to even possibly double-digit additional decline of the Ukrainian economy. Like besides direct and like very clear short-term economic consequences, certainly like there are longer-term consequences and longer-term risks. The biggest risk is certainly migration. We saw before this Russian terrorist attacks, small but significant inflow of Ukrainian refugees from abroad back to Ukraine. Now, like we see that in small amounts, but like the flow changed direction. And if disruptions become even more severe, then it could result in the second wave of refugees like coming to the European Union and other neighboring countries. It will have not only impact on those exception countries, but certainly on the Ukrainian economy, as it will have additional impact on consumption, negative impact of consumption on production as well. So like what help Ukraine will need now to withstand this terrorist pressure is like firstly like help especially in kind with needed equipment, especially transformers for the power grid, as Russia deliberately targeted transformers in these attacks. Then it could be a financial help for buying like natural gas, additional natural gas. It could increase production on those surviving thermal power plants and increasing the supply to the power network of Ukraine. And then in the worst scenario, it could be an import of electricity from the EU, while just months ago Ukraine was able to export electricity. And certainly like air defense as like the best insurance against further destruction is needed as soon as possible, and certainly like our partners understand this need, and it is crucial. And certainly like budget assistance is needed to withstand this additional pressure on economy and losses and decrease in well-being affecting Ukrainian citizens.
Thank you, Gleb. And we'll come back to that in terms of what specifically Ukraine needs to get from the West. But I want to zoom out now a bit from the events on the ground and talk a little bit more about some of the political questions, so to speak, and starting with the perceptions of this war, which I think is also a very important question to discuss here in Belgrade today. One of sort of the centerpiece of Russia's narrative engineering has been to frame this war as a standoff between Russia and NATO, whereby Ukraine is only the collateral damage, and it's really because NATO has failed to meet Russia's legitimate interest that this war has come about. And this narrative has had some success, including here in Serbia, as we heard earlier. Maria, I'd like to turn to you. How do you address some of these fundamental misperceptions about the war and its underpinnings?
I think it's very important because Russia doesn't actually create nothing new for any of the regions. It just manipulates with the same messages, just covering it a little bit differently when it comes to North Africa, to the Middle East, or to Western Europe. Because the main Russian narrative is that Russia is fighting not Ukraine but NATO, didn't appear just from the very beginning of the war. So let's remember that in February and even in March, Russia actually pushed the narrative that this is denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine and elimination of so-called Nazi government of Ukraine. And only when failed with this blitzkrieg against Ukrainian army and Ukrainian society, because we perceive it as like the war of Ukrainian people against aggressor, against imperialistic Russia's attempts to colonize Ukraine one more time. So it's not just about army fighting. When Russia failed, they sent another message that no, they couldn't fail to Ukraine. They couldn't be defeated by a regular army of Ukraine, which was underestimated both by Russia and our Western partners. That's why they created this narrative and put it on the first place that they are fighting NATO or they are fighting the whole West. Because when you are fighting the whole West and cannot win even Donbass, that's not such an embarrassing for Russian imperialistic, let's say, image. And that's why they push this message, and at the same time they're just playing with anti-American sentiments all over the world. I spent a couple of months in Qatar. What I found there, just Russian experts working for decades in the region, they send the same message as in Western Europe, but just using the Iraq case. In Balkans, they use their own specific let's say, NATO or the problems with American sentiments. In Germany, they also use the anti-American instruments, sending their experts saying publicly that America is like the leader of NATO, but you have to, to lead this organization equally because everyone should be equal. So basically, this is an attempt of Russia to justify what they are actually doing in Ukraine. Second important message, that Russia tries to justify, but someone else aggressive policy, mistakes, participation in some kind of wars or military interventions. They use that experience to justify their aggressive war against Ukraine. And what they're saying basically is, if someone else did something bad, I'm just hyperbolizing right now, in that or that country, why are we not allowed to do something bad towards Ukraine? But Ukraine is fighting for its territory, which is our sovereign territory, for its independence, and for international law. So it means that defending Ukrainian territorial integrity, any country around the world, just signifies they are in favor of the principle of territorial integrity, like it's stated, and it should be defended. It should be put just from theory of United Nations Charter into the practical area of public policy. And third important message when it comes to Russia narrative on international arena, Russia tries to show that Ukraine is completely in this war. It's not just a collateral damage coming to Ukraine, but it's about Ukraine being not able to make independent decisions like a puppet government of the West or so on. But if you will go a little bit deeper into the local context, you will understand that empire never recognize, until there are domestic changes within the country with imperialistic sentiments, they will never recognize the former part of this empire as something able and capable of independent decisions. And that's what we are fighting for. As I like to repeat, under certain circumstances, you can make people make political decisions. You can make politicians start some kind of negotiations or whatever, but you can never force the people and even the army to fight and fight effectively. And even the military experts, Mikhailo can say about this much better than I do, they now, I think, reassess the importance of motivations when it comes to the capabilities of the army to resist. Because what we are seeing on the ground, basically, that Ukrainian motivations of the same ordinary people who were mobilized voluntarily in the spring, and as a result of their own decision, they came to military conscription offices, and they were mobilized. Their motivation rules and drives their successes on the ground, while people mobilized in Russia doesn't understand what they're doing. And if I may, just 1 minute about some very important data regarding occupied territories.
We'll come to that data, but let me also bring in Mikhailo on this. And again, it's this question, and Maria explained that very well. So Russia's very effectively used anti-Western sentiment. It has exploited grievances from the recent past. And there is a lot to be said about these grievances, and we do not condone any of that, but it has nothing to do with the war in Ukraine. But it has been successfully used to gain support for that war. So how does Ukraine make its case to those countries that have not yet condemned Russia's aggression and that are still sitting on the fence? Because their support will be very critical also at the global level, at the UN level, to drive any Ukrainian initiatives forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I support Maria, everything that talking about NATO, it's absolutely fake. It's an anti-Americanism, and especially here, for example, in Serbia, using the pattern like, okay, Russia is fighting with NATO is very easily here to explain people that why actually they shouldn't support Ukraine and why they should be, let's say, neutral in this war. It's very easy. If they fighting with NATO, we remember in 1999, so it's very easy to understand for Serbian people why they should be outside of this war, because two Slavic nations fighting each other, okay. But in the same time, I would say that no NATO in this case, absolutely no NATO. And Russian leadership, and especially Putin, absolutely understand it, never will fight with NATO, never will fight with NATO. Even now, if you look at the map, and you see the military units of Russia, they put out all of military units from Finland border. Even Finland now is becoming a NATO member. So if they are afraid of NATO, if they are preparing for a war with NATO, they should send more troops to Finland border. But at the same time, they put it out and then send it to Ukrainian front. And actually, everything in this war about the imperialistic complex of Putin and people like Dugin. I strongly advise you read Dugin books, every explanation here. In all of Dugin geopolitics, explanation of Ukrainian question, they call it like this. How to solve Ukrainian question? Only one or couple sentences in big book. Just solve Ukrainian question. This is answer. Yeah. That's all. Solve Ukrainian question means they don't recognize Ukrainian as a nation, the separate nation. They talking about that Ukrainians are only Russians, but with zombie propaganda in the head. So denazification means to kill Ukrainians, which is not trying to be proper Russians. This is clear fascism and Nazism, but this fascism, Nazism proclaim that they are fighting with Nazism. Yeah. This is explanation. And one word about the perceiving and how to understand this war. We are fighting for values. Values, again, to be free, to live in country which we want to build. And we explained it for Putin several times. In 2004-5, the first revolution. Second, 2014, when the revolution on dignity, and of course, 2014, the start of the war. this is a question of values, this is a question of revenge of Putin. He told that the collapse of Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, and he understood that he is a messiah with mission to solve this problem, to build a Soviet Union or Soviet Empire 2.0 again. And Ukrainian understanding of this war, we won't give you a chance to do it.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think this is very important to underline this point, this imperialist nature of the war, and not a great power game, as it is often seen. Maria, let's talk now about the perceptions of Ukrainians of the war. I mean, you've already painted, I think, a picture with what you've said previously of a very determined nation, right? Ukrainians want to win the war. They want to regain all of the illegally occupied territories, as you mentioned. Just give us a bit, in 1 minute, a bit of insight into exactly where popular attitudes are on the war and the end of the war.
Ukrainians were not ready to compromise about Ukrainian territory even before February 24th. I have been dealing with Russian-Ukraine conflict since 2014, basically because I'm originally from the frontline areas in Luhansk region, so I have the emotional and personal motivation to start researching it as an expert. And during all these 8 years of war, when it came to assessing the compromises, whether Ukrainians were ready to sacrifice Crimea or 30% of the Donbas at that time in order to, let's say, solve the conflict with Russia. The answer was no, in different forms, but no. So no autonomy, no special status, no recognition of annexation of Crimea. That was with which kind of sentiments we entered this stage of large-scale invasion. And after February 24th, things became even less, people became even less ready to any kind of compromises about Ukrainian territory. That's very important. So now, the victory of Ukraine, so 72% are strongly believing that the victory of Ukraine should look like complete withdrawal of Russian forces from the entire Ukrainian territory. So it's very important to understand when someone tries to offer Ukrainians to sell out part of its territories, this decision under no circumstances can be legitimized by Ukrainian society. And you can never make a deal without understanding how this decision will be legitimized or not legitimized by the people on the ground. Moreover, 20% out of the 72, they state that besides of full withdrawal of Russian forces from the entire Ukrainian territory, Russian army generally has to be destructed, or some kind of destructive and disintegration processes within the Russian Federation itself should start in order that we will be able to say that this is the victory of Ukraine. That's very important. But withdrawal of Russian forces is like 100% priority number one. Crimea is not discussed. Donbas is not discussed. Before February 24, Ukrainians at least got used to coexist with partially occupied Donbas and Crimea. But after February 24, we understand that Crimea will always be a military base because what Russia did, just militarized Crimea and made it a huge military basis on the border with continental part of Ukraine. So without liberation of Crimea, there will be no the end of this war. Another important point which makes me proud of, let's say, our research, which we conduct even in the times of the war, is that we find out that there is no, referring to the title of this conference, there is no request or demand for authoritarian tendencies or for the regime of the strong hand in Ukraine, even in the times of a large-scale invasion. What we see in August this year in face-to-face public opinion poll, nationwide and representative one in Ukraine, that the 65% of the people saying that choosing between strong hand regime like authoritarian regime and democracy, they are strongly supporting democracy. And the request for this kind of model of governing increased since last year, which was more calm, let's say. So people understand the value of democratic procedures, even if someone might think that in the times of the war, people were tending for rapid decisions without specific procedures, without democracy, and so on. And the last but not the least point, is that when we asked people again at the end of August this year, what social feelings do they have when they think about the future of Ukraine, 65% say that they have hope in a better future, 40% saying that they have optimism about Ukrainian future. And on the third place comes the anxiety about Ukrainian future with 30%. And when I compared this data with the last year data, I found out that the share of people having hope and optimism about Ukrainian future has risen by 10 up to 20% since last year. So it's about resilience, it's about belief in our own capabilities, and that's what drives Ukrainian to keep on fighting and push our Western partners to support Ukraine up to the full liberation of Ukrainian territory.
Right. Okay, some very high expectations and a lot of optimism. Now, Liliana, you have also done research into this with your organization, and let's just move a little bit further ahead, looking into the outlook of for peace, which it is hard to imagine right now. But how do Ukrainians envision peace, and under what conditions right now?
Yeah, I can very much agree with what Maria already have put, that for now, Ukrainians don't see any possibility of peaceful negotiations under these circumstances, but we all understand that all wars are ending, and this war should end as well. Ukrainians now are, from what we understood in doing our research on thoughts and feelings of Ukrainians during the war, it is not representative research. This is a research when we asked people open-ended questions, and so we have some insights of how Ukrainians see the future of Ukraine after the war, and how we see the relations with Russia, and what is possible in the future. So from what we understood is that it's not only about the full military defeat of Russia in this war anymore. It's important that we will set up new era of relations with Russia and Russian society. It's interesting that when we asked people the question, what is the most important thing for you to be in the future of Ukraine? So people responded many different actually thoughts, and many people see that Ukraine should be a stronger democracy, that Ukraine should be stronger military as well. But what was surprisingly for me, what I was surprised with, is that Ukrainians actually they are afraid to turn into what is happening in Russia or Belarus. So, like, they are afraid of turning to the point where the society is more radicalized, or turning to the point where all of the people cannot control what the government does. And so this a great demand for the reforms and democratic reforms are still present in the Ukrainian society, even during the war. And so I would like to answer this question about the prospects for reconciliation with Russia, is that reconciliation would be possible only if Russian society will change. And this is very important that Ukrainians see the difference between these societies, because it was not always the case. We were always looking at what is happening in Moscow and what are they are doing. Now it's pretty much obvious that Ukrainians will need Russian society to be open, tolerant, and ready to ask for forgiveness for the reconciliation.
Right. Thank you very much. And so I want to also go back to Gleb, who is waiting patiently online, and actually turn to some more positive and forward-looking issues, thinking of Ukraine's EU integration. Ukraine has received EU candidate status in record time from the moment of its application. And we've also heard promises by European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen to integrate Ukraine as soon as possible into the EU single market. So, Gleb, can you tell us briefly what does Ukraine's EU integration in time of war deliver for the Ukrainian people and for the Ukrainian state?
Yes, even in times of war, the prospect of a single market for goods and services is very important for doing business in Ukraine, for establishing new cooperation, new business between Ukraine and EU companies. And currently we have a temporary regime of exporting Ukrainian goods to the European market, to the EU market without duties and without quotas, which is very important for Ukraine, for Ukrainian business in times of war, that this regime will be continued, and that this decision is made as soon as possible so that businesses could plan their activities. And even like when speaking about like this transitionary period between war and post-war times, I think that we need to have like this intermediate integration of Ukraine into single markets, not waiting till the final political decision is made. And in fact, like this first temporary regime for goods is a way for de facto integration of Ukraine into single market for goods and then services. Also, it is like the current regime of temporary protection of Ukrainian refugees in the EU is like the same first step of de facto integration of Ukraine into the single labor market. And then like making a final political decision and very clear vision of the willingness of the EU countries to accept Ukraine, that like in the nearest future could be shown in opening negotiations with Ukraine on EU accession. It is also will be very important in post-war period, in early post-war period for attracting private investment to Ukraine. That is also crucial. Like when we heard this figure of 750 billion of dollars needed for Ukraine reconstruction and modernization, the half of this figure is in fact expected private investment. But also we need to get a finance to have this funding that we expect to receive from the European Union for rebuilding of Ukraine to be in fact like the part of EU accession financing, and it should be considered very clearly like what like how this funding is helping Ukraine in becoming part of the European Union, to becoming competitive member of the EU. So it is also like an intellectual challenge that need to be addressed in the coming months.
Thank you, Gleb. And so there is all the benefits that integration into the market can bring, and all the other issues you've highlighted. But of course, there's also the emergency financial needs that Ukraine has right now. And we are just 2 days after the Berlin International Conference on Ukraine's reconstruction. But there's still a lot of uncertainty in terms of the money that Ukraine is actually getting from its Western partners. Do you think that Ukraine's partners in the EU and in the US are delivering what they can? And what is Ukraine's appeal to them right now?
Yes, certainly the sense of urgency was not enough on the side of our partners, especially if we speak, unfortunately, about the European Union, as there was a perception that US will be like the sort of in charge of military assistance and the EU will be in charge of economic and financial assistance. Then we saw that really like that promises that were made by the EU Council as early in May, are very slow to materialize in real disbursements, and like this feeling of like looming issue for Ukraine, especially if we speak about next year, was like in the heart of this conference in Berlin on October 25th. So here, like we really speak about like the most urgent need for Ukraine winning the war. Like if we speak about financial part of it, is funding the budget deficit, that is in the area of 3 to 5 billion US dollars, dependent on the scenario. That is on its side also dependent on the issues that we discussed before, of the destruction of civilian energy infrastructure. And like while for the remaining months of 2022, the issue is more or less closed, then even first quarter of 2023 is currently in the fog for Ukrainian Ministry of Finance with no clear expectations of disbursements. Like there are commitments from the US, commitments from the EU, but there is no clear perception that like mechanisms to get this money flowing smoothly is in place yet. But certainly, like we need also to start speaking about the fast recovery, as we see this hits on civilian infrastructure, but also unfortunately we lost a summer that could be spent on rebuilding housing in liberated areas of Ukraine and on rebuilding infrastructure, just as like President Zelensky said in Berlin that unfortunately we haven't received a cent. Ukraine has not received a cent for recovery. Unfortunately, like there were some smaller bilateral commitments, but it was certainly not enough. And then like we also need to speak about like full recovery, because like as it was discussed by other panelists, like the situation is very fluid and if, for example, because of some reasons Ukraine wins or Russia loses fast, like there is certainly no clear vision of how this hundreds of billions that need to be channeled to Ukraine for the purposes of reconstruction, like where to find these hundreds of billions. Like will it be like legal solution related to using Russian assets? Will it be EU funding that will be in fact accession funding? It is certainly not like there is no answer, we need to find this answer fast.
Absolutely, thank you very much. So I think with that, and because we've started a few minutes later, I would now like to open the floor to the audience. I think we started about 10 minutes later or so, so we'll have 10 or so minutes now to take questions from our guests here in the room. Please raise your hand, make yourself known, introduce yourself before you ask your question, and you can also say who you'd like to address your question to. Any immediate reactions or comments? And unfortunately, we won't be able to take questions from those who are present online. We'll have to privilege those who are in the room today. All right, there seems to be a... we have a question right there. Sorry, I didn't see you earlier.
I'm sorry, it's not a question, it's some...
If it's a comment, please just keep it brief.
My name is Vladimir Tolkac. I'm ambassador of Ukraine here in Serbia. And I would like, first of all, to explain my appreciation for participants and for organizers of this very important event for Ukraine. It's first what I would like to say. And second, I would like to turn your attention for now one little thing. We saw this process, how spread Russian aggression. It's begun not now. It's begun from monopolization of the victory of the Second World War, when Kazakhstan, Ukraine, other republic out of this victory. Only Russia won in this war, and Russia, the main anti-fascist player in the world. Second, we saw how a lot of time Russian became and tried to struggle neo-Nazi in Ukraine and other republics. And now Russia understands that neo-Nazi, it's not group, it's all Ukrainian nation. We are not neo-Nazi, but I use this determination of Russia. And after this, Russian began to struggle with all Ukrainian nation. Now it's our nation under the attack, the full attack of Russia. But it's not, I would like to turn your attention that it's not final point of Russia. Now Poland, Czech Republic, Baltic countries under the same enemy, because all of us try to struggle with Russian. We not struggle with Russian. We struggle with the regime of Russian Federation. First of all, it's very enemy regime for all of us. And I would like to turn your attention, Ukrainian war, it's not war only for Ukraine. It's war for all democratic countries, for all who would like to be the members of the European family and for democratic values. Thanks. That's what it's. I'm sorry that I disturbed your, but that's what I would like to say. One more thank you for all of organizers.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Unless we have other questions, okay, we'll take one more question here.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of these panelists for this excellent presentation. My name is Edward Joseph from the U.S. Obviously, the support from the United States as the leader of NATO has been critical to the war effort in supporting this, the determination, motivation of Ukraine to fight for its freedom and sovereignty. But we have elections coming up very soon in the United States. And these midterm elections, you may have seen the comments of Kevin McCarthy, who would become the new Speaker of the House of Representatives, saying, we will not give no more open check to Ukraine. So I just quickly would like your comments. You know, the United States is not just another country in terms of its support for the effort in Ukraine, and how you anticipate that, and if the Republicans were to win, and obviously we have a specter of potentially return of a former president whose relationship with Russia is quite dubious. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we've had two very important comments and a question. I think this is all really that we have time for now. And I'd like to invite all of the speakers to actually address these in their final 1-minute comments. And I would add from my side as well, if you could in that also say a few words about how you see now the prospects for moving forward and getting to peace. Also looking at this very coercive Russian signaling that we have seen over the last months. Where do we need to get and under what conditions you would see a just peace for Ukraine? So let's start with Gleb, who is online, and then we'll come to the speakers here.
I think that my answer also is answer to the question from the audience. I believe that like what all our partners, including American administration, current American administration and current American members of the parliament have to do is to do as much as possible to Ukraine fast. Like in terms of the United States, it is authorizing as much financial and military assistance right now before these by-elections to the parliament, to the Congress. And it will not only like mitigate the risks mentioned, but also it will in fact Ukraine winning the war faster will in fact result in less expenditures, less money spent by the taxpayers of our partners for helping Ukraine in winning the war. Thank you.
Thank you, Gleb. Mikhailo, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think that talking about the position of the United States and next American administration, it's very easy to answer. Let's model situation if Russia wins. And what we see after this, China will join Russia, join another Iranian, let's say, authoritarianism with maybe nuclear weapon very soon, because Russia, I am sure Russia now is transferring nuclear and a weapon to Iran. And I'm sure that United States and other NATO countries should pay attention on this, if they understand it. But if we model it, and if we model this situation, I hope that it's not only political talking about it, if United States administration, next administration, Republicans, Democratic, it's doesn't matter. They model the situation of transferring the world after Russia wins, they will support Ukraine. We don't need open checks. We don't need money. We just need more weapon. And if we're talking about how the American land-lease work, it's not the money for Ukraine. It's only leasing of weapons, which we will back you after victory. So the answer is very simple. United States, next administration of United States will support Ukraine because it's our interest of United States. Do not allow authoritarian countries, dictatorship countries, to be the strongest power and strongest force in next future. I am not sure that all of us want to live in such a world.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Liliana, final words?
Yeah, I would like to end up on that and to say that Ukraine government have presented its recovery plan, recovery and reconstruction plan just after 4 months after the full-scale invasion of Russia. And this plan actually, maybe someone do not know about that, or maybe do not imagine how the plan was actually discussed, but it was joint. It was joint actions of Ukrainian government and of civil society organizations, because it was also possible even in April, May, when the huge battles were going on that times, even on the time when the Mariupol defenders were still there in the Mariupol fighting, civil society organizations were able to propose some solutions for the reforms, and we were able to do it in more than 20 thematic divisions. And I think it's great that now we see that both society.
In American context, in the American domestic context, it's completely different from Ukrainian question in Russian domestic conflict. So the Ukrainian question in America, and Ukraine has always benefited from it, was always something uniting two parties. And I am pretty sure that here, based on national interests of US, Ukraine, European Union general interest, we will not lose this kind of support, even in the case that Republicans will run the Congress. And what's next? That's a very important question. So next month, I'm pretty sure we will hear louder signals from Russia through different channels about their so-called readiness for negotiations. Let's not be fooled with these messages. Russia needs some kind of a pause. Their almost 200,000 army has gone, wounded, killed, whatever. That's why they are conducted now not partial but full mobilization in Russia, and they conducted forceful mobilization of Ukrainian people in occupied territories in violation of all international humanitarian law, which is prohibited according to 4th Geneva Convention, to conscript, to enforce people to participate in the army, police, whatever. People in occupied areas are fully locked. Since middle of the summer, men aged 18-35 are not allowed to leave these territories. So the only way to escape was to leave occupied areas via Crimea, then to Russia, and then through Latvia or Estonia to the European Union or to Georgia. So Russia is doing now, they are trying to make a fake picture of their readiness for negotiations. They need a pause, they need to mobilize people, they need to find some other arms like they are doing right now from Iran, and they make their very important short-term strategy is to decrease, to slow down the military support to Ukraine, because as soon as there is any kind of a hope for negotiations, let's say, or someone believes in that hope, the military support will automatically, according to Western diplomacy logic, will be decreased, because this is the logic of the West. If you are negotiating, you are not fighting. In terms of Russia, if you are negotiating, you are fighting more. And what we have seen in Donbass since 2014, every time Russia sat down Minsk I, Minsk II, they happened in the light of incredible severe attacks on Debaltseve, on Ilovaisk, on Ukrainian Donetsk airport. So that is the normal logic of Russia. So not be fooled. The sooner Ukraine will defend its air by air defense system, additional ones, anti-missile system, the sooner we will be able to conduct land operations on the ground and liberate Ukrainian territories.
Great. Thank you so much, Maria. And this is a really important, stark message and warning, actually, to take away from this discussion. Please join me in thanking our panelists for their excellent insights into this. Thank you.
Hello? Oh, hi. Okay, so as people are coming in and out, I just want to move along. I want to thank every one of our panelists who just spoke. And we're moving on to the next panel, Russia and the war against Ukraine. So basically, How does Russia perceive the war right now, or as they know it, the military operation? And basically, how is Russia going to face the challenges in terms of manpower going forward? So I would like to introduce our panel: Maxim Sorokov, Andrei Illarionov, Alexandra Popropinko, and Natasha Yemifova-Trilling. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you for those who have attended this session. I want to dive right in. We've been asked to look at internal Russian responses and impacts of the war in Ukraine. We're going to zoom out, zoom in, zoom back out, and hopefully have time for some questions. So, as you all know, Russia is a giant country. It has 80-some constituent territories, and the overwhelming majority of those are not self-sufficient financially. They rely on Moscow for their funding. The war is very costly. Moscow's resources are finite, they're limited, and so the depletion of those resources is hitting the regions in very different ways. Some analysts are already saying, look, the Russian Federation is looking very fragile. So I want to begin with Andrei, who's both an economist and many years ago had worked directly advising the Russian government, who so has a unique perspective on this. I'd like you to tell us a little bit about how you see the depletion of these resources that are being used up in the war affecting the internal Russian situation, Moscow's relationship with the regions, and more generally.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to this conference. Let me start, first of all, with the title for the whole conference, which is in the upper right corner. I think it's incorrect. It says war in Ukraine. It is not true. It is war against Ukraine. And this is actually the style that which is very much liked by Kremlin, just to put in the center of attention Ukraine, but avoid attention of the main culprit of this war, Russia or Kremlin or Putin. So the correct title should be the title of our session, War Against Ukraine, or Russian War Against Ukraine, or Kremlin War Against Ukraine, or Putin's War Against Ukraine. Second, many people already have said that this war has been launched on February 24th, 2022. It is not true. The conventional war against Ukraine has been launched on February 20th, 2014. So that is why we are now almost for full 9 years of this war. But this is only one part of the big imperialist war that Mr. Putin has launched. And he has launched this war not only against Ukraine, but also against Georgia in year 2008, against Moldova, against many other nations, against Europe. So that is, and also It is war against freedom, against democracy, against human rights in many other countries, including in Russia. So this is a very long war. Now coming to your very important questions. Military analysts, as well as geopolitical analysts and economic analysts, are looking for a number of most important factors that allow Putin or Kremlin to wage this war and continue this war. I would mention some of them, especially it has been discussed at the first session. The losses of the Russian troops in this war against Ukraine probably total is up to 200,000 people, including those who have been killed, wounded, taken prisoners of war, and so on. It's enormous number, it's enormous losses, but as we know right now, up to today, Kremlin was able to mobilize more than 530,000 new conscripts. In addition to those, probably between 200,000 and 300,000 Russian troops already fighting in this war. So the total number, it could be already close to 700,000 to 800,000 troops ready to participate or already participating in this war. But it's not the end of the story. According to a number of estimates, Putin will be able to mobilize up to 1.4 or maybe 1.5 million people by the end of this coming winter. So that is why the size of Russian army will be multiplied. We need to look into the total number of reserves, mobilization reserve for Russia. Now it's been calculated that it is between 25 and 29 million people. So we don't know, we're not sure that all of those people will be mobilized, but definitely assuming the desperation of Mr. Putin in his desire to achieve victory in this war against Ukraine and against Europe, we cannot exclude that there will be new waves of mobilization with many more people. Assuming the rate of losses on the battlefield, it means that this war can last for years. Second very important factor is the availability of military equipment. So there are different numbers exist for different elements of military equipment like tanks, artillery pieces, jets, helicopters, all other stuff. Based on the most reliable estimates of the losses on the battlefield, during these 8 months of war, Russia lost, depending on different items, between 10 to 25% of military equipment. It is not hard to estimate if between 10 and 25% of equipment have been lost. So Russia is still in possession, at least for the most important elements of equipment like tanks, between 75 to 90% of equipment that it had at the beginning of this latest stage of the war.
Well, I think we've heard the most important thing. That
let me finish with the last one, because it gives us the perspective how much this war can be waged. So that is why, assuming even this critical element of these losses, it means this war can last at least for 2 more years, even, let's say, rely on the number of available tanks. The next one, probably even the most important factor that could allow us to calculate how long this war can last is the volume of foreign exchange reserves in Russia. First of all, at the very beginning of this stage of the war, on February 24th, the foreign exchange reserves of Russia would allow Putin to wage this war for at least 4 years. After the Western countries frozen up to $300 billion in foreign exchange reserve, and after Russia lost slightly more than $100 billion in reserve over the last 8 months, and assuming some other little facts that we don't have time now to discuss, those liquid pot of the foreign exchange reserve that is still in possession of Kremlin would allow it to continue war, probably not more than for 17 and 18 months. This calculation gives us a very important idea. What are the most crucial directions of the joint efforts, both of Ukraine and partners of Ukraine and allies of Ukraine, how to get to the victory in this war and how bring closer the end of this bloody war.
So thank you very much. So we're looking at a very long story, right? At least a year and a half more. And I want to turn to Alexandra, who's, as a sociologist, you've done some work exploring there's a whole stratum in Russia of educated people, so-called technocrats, who have been quite impressive from a Russian domestic standpoint of keeping the economy functioning, the country functioning. Certainly sanctions and all the costs of the war have hit the Russian population, but in a much lighter way than many people have predicted. And that is in part thanks to this stratum of technocrats. So tell us a little bit about why these people keep working. Is it just fear, or is there something else happening there? You've studied this.
Hello, and thanks for having me here. So speaking about Russian elites, especially about Russian technocrats, they're divided on two camps, so-called peace camp and war camp. And people from the war camp, that's mostly those who works in the government or in the economic sector. Well, they're actually, those with whom I spoke, and as my colleagues spoke, they're actually against the war, but they're very reluctant to become vocal about it. Of course, they're scared to death because, well, they really think that if they will stand opposed in public of the war, they will immediately go to jail. That's also the reason why they're still keeping their positions. And the second reason why they're still in Russia and why they continue doing what they do is, as I calling it's a habit of it's a habit to be efficient, because last 10 years, last 10 years, what they are keeping to. Being efficient, that was the main goal of what they're doing, and a huge part of being efficient was not taking part in politics. So they do only economy. And they showed that they showed with themselves that. Politics can be separated from economics. So even now, they're speaking about the war in terms of efficacy. So they are quite. They think that Putin is not very efficient with the war, and Ministry of Defense and these paramilitants who are taking part with the war, that they can. Behave on the battlefield much more efficient, which is, well, I was surprised to hear that from them. So they're still continuing to do that, and I think that now, in spring, they were not. They did not feel themselves like those who are taking part in the war. They were just spectators of it. So. Well, the war actually concerned them when the mobilization was started, and now we can see that lots of people flew away, and lots of people who work in central bank, in state governments, that they leave the country and continue to work remotely. So that's talking about the peace camp. And the war camp, I actually feel that there are only few of people who are really, will be glad to see tanks in Kiev, but mostly these people are anticipating the hawkish mood of Putin. So they are, they're very loud on internet, and, they are not influenced any decisions that Putin can take.
Thank you. Yeah, so I know that in your work you also noted that a lot of these people, they sort of are used to breaking certain rules in the pursuit of their efficiency.
Yeah.
So, well, Maxim, I want to then move on to you with the question, thanks to, in large part, to these technocrats, for ordinary Russians, again, up until the mobilization was announced, they could live ignoring the war largely. And certainly we saw in public opinion polling very old cleavages emerge where younger people who get their news mostly online were slightly more pro-Western, and older people who get their news from state television were quite rabidly anti-Western, but nonetheless, the government's, especially Putin's, approval ratings have remained incredibly high, even caveats about public opinion polling notwithstanding. So I'd like you to tell us a little bit about the moods, the trends in the moods in public opinion in Russia, and how you see them developing and unfolding.
Yeah, you have mentioned many important factors. I think we, surprisingly for such a repressive dictatorship, we can speak quite freely and about the results of opinion polls in Russia, and they still remain quite reliable. And what we can state now is that Russian society, the majority of Russian society, does support this war, but is not very enthusiastic about this war. Yeah, we see that even after the mobilization, the share of Russians who support the war remains very high, surprisingly high, over 70%, up to 80%. But that's, some people explain this, that people are just afraid to tell that they're against the war. And probably it's true in some cases, but I think in the majority of cases, it's rather that people just naturally support their country which is at war. They don't dwell too much into details, and it's just an instinct. Yeah, our country is at war. We have been brought up in the atmosphere where sacrifices for the sake of war is the supreme merit. So we should sacrifice everything we have because our country is at war. Yeah, and we should not doubt it. This was the whole upbringing that Russia kept from the Soviet times. So I think this is quite realistic figures that this support is over 70% overall. But if you just make a step aside and ask people some more detached questions, like how do you feel about the current situation, you see that actually that Russian society is not really happy about what is going on. We see that the share of people who feel despair, stress, fear is almost half of the society, yeah, which demonstrates very negative tendencies in the public mood. And if, for example, the support for ending the war, for starting negotiations, is also rising and is surprisingly high. Depending on the poll, it's over the half of the population. Yeah, so we see that people are ready to support Russia because it's waging the war, ready to support the government because it's waging the war in the name of their country, but still they'd rather prefer to have this war stopped. And generational cleavages, which are also very important. We see it's probably the most important factor determining whether a person supports the war or not. We see that in the age brackets below 30 years, below 40 years, the support for the war dives down extremely. In the most among the retired people, it's over 90%, while among people below 35, you have like less than a half are supporting the war. And I think it's not only because they get the news from a different source, not only because they use internet, but also because the Russian propaganda is designed in the way to appeal to the older generations, to Soviet generations, because its main viewer of this propaganda is Putin himself, who is of this Soviet older generation. So the whole propaganda is not even intended to appeal to younger people. It is intended to appeal to older people. And the second is that the costs for younger generations of Russia are much higher than the ones for the older generations. It's younger Russians who are losing their career opportunities, who are deprived of the ability to live fashionable Western style of life. It's younger Russians who are being mobilized, so little wonder that they are less supportive of the war than the older generations.
Those are very good points, certainly, and their planning horizons have shrunk tremendously. And you mentioned propaganda, and Alexandra, I wanted to come back to you. You know, part of the description of this panel panel was that the Russian government has definitely tightened the space for dissent, for a free exchange of opinions. And I wanted to ask you to describe some of the mechanisms now at work, some of the propaganda tactics, some of the fear tactics. We certainly, I see, you know, certainly among the older Russians with whom I speak, very much this sense that the West is against us, the West is attacking us, the West has surrounded us. It harkens back to their younger days. It's a very recognizable paradigm, and it's re-entrenched itself quite well. But talk to us about more generally about propaganda and fear.
Right, but first I want to bring some numbers to Maxim's answer that there was a recent poll made by, I think, Russian Field, that's independent sociology company. So, and the answer was that 60% of Russians would support Putin if he launched a new attack on Kyiv, but more than 75% will support Putin if he stops the war right now.
Yeah.
And that's the same amount of people, which obviously shows that they will support any decision of the government.
Well, it's more would support the end,
but
right? 75% would support the end.
Will support the end, and I truly believe that Russian society will support the end of this war and will be happy about it. And speaking about propaganda, as it was mentioned, right? So the Kremlin designed very good tools to influence the older people, But speaking about overall in economics, what they're trying to do, they're trying to paint the economic picture of a Russian stand, not in the real blue colors as it is. So there is a demand from Kremlin to speak in public that in economics everything is going well. There is some sort of Kremlin newspeak they're using. So when they're calling decline negative growth, because growth sounds more happier than decline. Yeah. So, economy minister or Putin's economic aide, Maxim Oreshkin, they're speaking that, well, Russian economy is going well, and well, the economic ties will renew, we will rebuild, we'll have much more other customers in the rest of the world. That only the West is against Russia, but the rest on the war is, well, they still want to trade with Russia, and they just saying this for many times, and I think that some of them become the victims of their own propaganda. They are not, well, they have pink glasses on their eyes and they don't see the real picture actually. Well, because in the March when I spoke with some people working in the government, they were absolutely, well, they believed that China will come, China and India will come and will help with microchips, with techniques, with all those imports which were banned by the West. And they were really surprised that neither China nor India didn't came and that Russia will face such problems with imports.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. And I want to for a moment go from what's happening in Russia now to turn to Andrei with a bit of a more aspirational question. The motto of those Russians who oppose the war is peace to Ukraine, freedom to Russia. So if we think about a long-term perspective or a medium-term perspective, and if you think about this idea of a free Russia, in practice, what would that mean? How would it be achieved? Is it even something worth talking about at this point?
I think it's a very important point, and it's very deeply intertwined with each other, both issues, peace for Ukraine and freedom for Russia. Earlier today, Maria Zolkin has said something very, very important, that the final victory for Ukraine can be achieved not only when all occupied territories will be liberated from occupying forces, but when Russia, regardless what kind of Russia, today's Russia, tomorrow's Russia, will not present any threat to Ukraine, and I would add to Georgia, to Moldova, to Baltic countries, to Belarus, to whole Europe, to Kazakhstan, to any country around the world. So that is why the root of the problem is in the title of our conference. As you remember, it is authoritarianism as the cause of the war. So this is a problem. So that is why in this kind of strategically thinking, the peace for Ukraine can be achieved only when the authoritarian system in Russia will cease to exist. This is a very simple and very brutal truth for everybody. As long as authoritarian regime exists in Russia and controls Kremlin, so there will be danger and there will be threat and risk for new wars against Ukraine, against other countries. So that is why we need to understand that there are several goals in this war, in this big war, and this war is not only war against Ukraine, but once again, this war against freedom and democracy, rule of law and human rights. The first step, yes, it's a liberation of all occupied territories of Ukraine. Second is providing security for Ukraine and other countries surrounding Russia. And the final solution to this problem is the freedom for Russia, which means destruction of authoritarian regime in the country.
Well, I'd like to pick up there and talking about the authoritarian regime in the country. There's a great debate, obviously, about to what extent is there a structural problem in Russia, and to what extent are the problems with authoritarianism in Russia, to what extent do they hinge on Putin as an individual? And in the West, certainly there has been a tendency to demonize Putin somewhat, and the most recent US national security strategy, for example, more or less says that we're not going to try to deal with Russia while Putin is still in place. So Maxim, I want to turn to you and ask you about this, because I would like to, in the previous panel, Iskra made a very clear distinction, for example, between the war as an imperialist project and the war as a great power competition, and she felt that it was the former, not the latter. But I would like to very much invite everyone present to just consider the possibility that in the minds of the Kremlin, that both things can be true. That yes, Ukraine is regarded as something not worthy of its own decisions. It's seen as a buffer, as a strategic buffer after decades of Russian military strategic thinking, of seeing Russia as vulnerable to attack from without, that there is this long tradition of seeing these threats as real. And so I wanted to ask Maxim, when eventually somebody will succeed Putin, we all go the same direction, right? So when that does happen, what do you see as the chances for a real break, a real discontinuity from his authoritarian repressive policies? And what do you see as the chances for some measure of continuity in whatever government comes next?
Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, Putin was not imposed on Russia by aliens. He is a product of Russian reality, and his world outlook is shared by wider Russian ruling elite, of course. But I think in case of this war, it was very much his personal project and his personal obsession. So in the eventuality when, we don't know under what circumstances he lives, he'll most probably will be replaced by one of his henchmen, probably with a security background, probably with similar world outlook. And this will bring quite high degree of continuity in the Russian policies. Yeah, that it will still remain an authoritarian country, it will still remain strongly anti-Western, but still, this new leadership, no matter who succeeds Putin, will be much more collective. And this will make it much more cautious, at least, and much more pragmatic, much more rational in many questions, and much easier to deal with. And what is most important, much less obsessed with Ukraine. Because even on the eve of this war, in the last days before the invasion started in February, we saw that the key Russian dignitaries were very hesitant. They were not very enthusiastic about the starting of the war. Everybody who had some influence actually somehow opposed it, even putting it, even packaging it in a very anti-Western way. They still, even at the last session of Russian Security Council, we saw a lot of high dignitaries saying in favor of continuing negotiations with the West. Yeah? And it just because it was Putin's personal decision to start the invasion, and they had to adhere to it. So they are much less obsessed with Ukraine, much more pragmatic, and any collective leadership is still much more flexible and easier to deal with than a personal leadership of a person who is not really in touch with reality any longer.
Yeah, yeah. So I want to, on that note, I'd like to go around from panelist to panelist. And you know, another word in the title of our panel is a watershed moment. So I'd like to ask each of you in turn to, from among the topics that we've discussed today, perhaps ones that we haven't touched upon, where do you see the potential in the current situation for watershed moments for the Russian position in this war against Ukraine right now? So Andrei, why don't we start with you?
If I may, just to comment on the previous question that we started to discuss, what is the deepest root of the Russian problems, of the Putin's problem or Russia's problem and so on. I see here at least 5 levels of problems, and each of them must be addressed. The first one is a personal issue of Mr. Putin, and it is very well understood now around the world. Second is the problem of corruption, a very small group of people who back in 1999 have chosen this person to become president of Russia. I would mention these names. Some of the, probably you haven't heard these names, but those 3 people are responsible for that the country has such a person as a president, for all these wars and the hundreds of thousands of people being killed. Valentin Yumashev, Tatiana Dichenko, daughter of President Yeltsin, and Alexander Voloshin. These 3 people have chosen that person and pushed him for the presidency. Third problem is institutional one, including the institutional design of the Russian Constitution adopted in 1993. Fourth is the Soviet heritage. Country never had the real de-Sovietization and decommunization. That is a crucial element for sustaining democracy, freedom, and human rights in the country. And the fifth is the heritage of the cultural heritage that is common for some, let me say openly, for some Eastern Orthodox countries. And from this point of view, Serbia and Russia also sharing some elements of that predisposal for appearance of such people and such stories in our countries. Coming to the most important question about the watershed. The long-term wars of attritions are being some kind of decided, first of all, not on the battlefield, but in the area of military finance. Before to beat the enemy on the battlefield, you need to have at least military financial parity, which means that your military expenditures should be at least equal with the military expenditure of the enemy. That was exactly the solution to the Second World War. Only when the allies, United States, United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union had military expenditures combined more than military expenditures of Axis, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and militarist Japan, they were able to achieve the turning point in the Second World War. Something similar is true for this war. Unfortunately, today, the military expenditure of Russia today is 2.5 times higher than Ukraine and partners of Ukraine that are supplying military equipment and armaments and so on to Ukraine. Russia spends today about $15 billion monthly. Ukraine spends roughly $4 billion monthly, and all military aid to Ukraine that's delivered to Ukraine is $2 billion US. So altogether $6 billion. This military aid is absolutely not enough to sustain this war, to get the military parity and more to achieve victory. If this military help, military aid will not be increased, let's say 5 times from the current level, the military victory for Ukraine and allies and partners are not achievable. It should be understood absolutely clear. This is a blunt truth. So that is why partners and friends and allies of Ukraine must increase military aid to Ukraine many-fold.
So it's the aid. Aid is going
This
to be
is
a watershed.
Only having achieved this military financial parity, Ukrainians on the battlefield will be able to achieve real victory on the fronts.
Alexandra, what are some of the watersheds you're thinking about?
I want to agree with Maxim's point that next Russian leadership will be much more pragmatic and less obsessed with the Ukraine. And what I know now for sure about Russian technocrats that they feel themselves much more cornered than Putin. And if Putin chosen the escalation tactics, they think that, well, okay, but he's the devil we know. They do not agree, but they are okay with this. Because they don't see any exit from the corner the West put them here. They're losing money, they're losing influence, they don't feel themselves safe, and maybe it's very unpopular, but maybe some talks with, maybe showing them some point of, not an exit, but maybe a point of that exit, of the possible exit from this corner, will be helpful to stop this conflict and, yeah.
Yeah, I think by many, I think many Russian elites do feel quite cornered because the sanctions that were meant to persuade them to exert pressure on Putin did not take into account that they have no influence on Putin. So instead, what happened is many of the Western sanctions imposed on Russian elites leave them in a more powerless situation than they were in before. Maxim, what are you thinking about watershed moments?
I'm thinking more about path dependency than about watershed moments, because I think the moment the decision to start the invasion was taken was a fatal one for the Russian regime. And now it's very difficult to ramp off, because it has to go on and on with the escalation. And I'm deeply convinced that no matter what security guarantees Ukraine can ever get from the Western countries, as long as Putin is in power in Russia, as long as he's in power, he'll still be obsessed with Ukraine. Ukraine is not safe. It's just, it will keep going and going and going. Of course, deteriorating, but continuing.
Yeah. I don't know if it'll be a watershed moment. I am curious to see what will happen in December when some of the new restrictions on European purchases of Russian energy take into effect, whether that will help achieve some of this, whether this will help put a dent in some of Russia's finances. That will be an interesting thing to watch. And I see that we've sped along so well that perhaps we'll have a moment before opening the floor to questions. I did want to ask Maxim, even though we've been asked to talk mostly about Russia domestically, I know that you've been looking very recently at the impact that the war has had on Russia's relations with some of the other former states, former Soviet republics, now independent states. And I wonder if you could just point out some of the key dynamics there to watch.
The key dynamic is very simple, is that Russia is so consumed by the war with Ukraine that it has no spare resources to upkeep its presence in other post-Soviet states, except for Belarus, which is in fact under de facto military occupation of Russia at the moment. We see that Russia's degree of control over Russia's ability to influence other countries of post-Soviet space has been undermined severely, and we see that Russia is almost outflanked in the negotiations on Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Now the West all of a sudden has taken the leading role as a mediator. We see that Russia has very tense relations with the new leadership of Kazakhstan, and we see even that some smaller countries of Central Asia who are very dependent, still very dependent on Russia economically and in terms of security, their leadership dares to criticize Putin in person, in his presence, in public. So we see that another loss caused by the war in Ukraine for Russia is its influence in the post-Soviet space.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think with that, we're able to open up the floor to questions, and I see the gentleman in the desk right there.
Thank you. Goran Buldiski, Open Society Foundation's excellent panel. I really enjoyed so many questions. I'll ask two. I reside in Berlin. There, they don't talk about Ukraine victory. They talk about Russia must not win. And it's a very careful statement. Can you unpack it from your perspective of view? What does it mean Russia cannot win? And my second question is, can you think about this, Maxim, you alluded now to these opportunities. The first time EU will send basically a peacekeeping mission in Nagorno-Karabakh, something that was terra incognita. What are the opportunities that are opening there? But can you elaborate a bit more? What does it mean for the elites in Moscow? And what does it mean for equally authoritarian elites in Turkey and whatnot? Because I believe the constellation is not just by the individual leader. These are elites that really are around this set of ideas. This will not die just with the change of the leader. So, too many questions, pick and choose. Thank you.
Should we go for everything? Right?
Yeah, Maxim, maybe you will start with the one that was directed to you, and then we can go around.
Nagorno-Karabakh. I'm not sure that the current audience is really interested in Nagorno-Karabakh. Okay, but just a short answer that this was made possible by the war. Yeah, that Russia all of a sudden, actually, it's that the rule-based world order is more attractive to smaller countries than the Russia's philosophy of realpolitik, where small countries have only to suffer, yeah, because of big countries. And so there is little wonder that both for Armenia and Azerbaijan, despite all their mutual acrimonies, the West turned out to be a more appropriate mediator than Russia is, because Russia kept pursuing its own interest in the region. And both countries, all of a sudden, turned out to be more interested in the Western mediation. How far it will go, we are not sure. Probably the prospects of Russia's presence in the region are very low because its closest ally, Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, was the root of Russia's presence in the South Caucasus. Yeah? And without this conflict, Russia will lose its key ally in the region, Armenia, yeah? Because without Karabakh, Armenia can pursue its integration with the West or cooperation with the West in a far more active manner. And now we see that already the backdrop for these developments are created when Armenia, despite being attacked by Azerbaijan already on its Armenian territory, Armenia is not really supported by Russia in this difficult minute, but it's supported by the West. And the West has already, over the past few months, just in several weeks, has created a lot of goodwill in Armenia, while Russia has lost all the goodwill it has accumulated over the past decades. So I'm quite skeptical about the prospects of Russia's presence in the South Caucasus, at least in the foreseeable future in the next few years.
And now if we are address this, the formulation in the West of that there's not talk of Ukraine's victory, but that Moscow cannot win, even though I suspect that this is more rooted in a European situation and context than on the ground. But Andrei, do you have any thoughts on that, on this distinction?
I think the best translation of this formula, Russia cannot win, is Russia's defeat. It's just only one plausible translation and explanation, because otherwise, as once again it has been explained this early session as well as in many other places, if somehow this line, front line will be preserved, some kind of with a part of Ukrainian territories being occupied, it means that after some pause in this military action, Kremlin, Putin, or whoever who could come after Putin would accumulate more forces, mobilize more resources, and will launch another war. It will be continuation of this war. When we were talking about after year 2008, after Russian-Georgian war, not very many people believed us. When we talked about after year 2014-15, that will be continuation of this war, still some people did not believe. Now in year 2022, everybody in Georgia, Ukraine, in all post-Soviet space, and many people around the world understand it very clearly. If the root of the problem, the regime in Kremlin, is not changed, the war will continue. It means more hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions of people, will perish in new wars. So that is why our purpose is just what we say, peace not only for Ukraine, peace for the world. And this peace for the world can be achieved only through destruction of authoritarian regime in Moscow.
Well, I'll take advantage of my position as moderator to add that I think that the paradox of this formula, that what we're after is that Moscow cannot win, is that we cannot allow Moscow to use force to change sovereign boundaries in Europe, to, right, it can't be might makes right. We cannot succumb to this reality that Russia is trying to force on the world. But of course, the grand obstacle to this is how many human lives, how much money, how many resources is the West willing to invest in this battle, right? Because Russia has already violated Ukraine's sovereignty, it has violated Georgia's sovereignty, but the cost-benefit analysis of, say, NATO and the Western nations of, you know, how much do we risk? Do we risk a full-out war with Russia in order to prevent this encroachment on the sovereignty of smaller countries? In the cost-benefit analysis, in the context of realpolitik, the decision was made, no, the costs are too high. So this tension is going to remain, right? Because the costs are going to be the same. So I think this is the dilemma that we're going to be facing for quite a long time.
I think, speaking of this, we need to define the victory. And in my humble opinion, the victory is that Russia will never be a threat to the Ukraine ever. So I don't know when and how it will be achieved, but I think that's the victory also, not only for the Ukraine or for the Europe, but also for Russia. And that's the point where the forces should be implied.
Yeah.
Just, in my opinion, the formula Russia cannot win means that Europe is afraid of Russia's defeat, because this defeat might imply unpredictable circumstances. Yeah, and so you need to package it in the way that is, on the one hand, not offensive to Ukrainians, but on the other hand, conveys the fear of Europe, of Russia's defeat, of major destabilization of huge nuclear power right on the border of Europe.
And if I may just, some people in the world kept forgetting that the war against Europe, against the world, is not the issue of tomorrow, it's issue of today, yesterday. So we know about this explosion on pipelines. We know about this person who has been killed in the downtown of Berlin. We know about people who have been poisoned in London. We know about the military stocks that have been exploded in Czech Republic. We know about the person who have been poisoned in Bulgaria. All this happened in Europe, and this is war against Europe. It's going on for years. People should not be blind and deaf and to see reality.
I wanted
and also once more, the attempt to overthrow the government in Montenegro.
Yeah, I do want to, I think Maxim has made a very good point also, that there's a very fragile balance also between, yes, we want Russia to stop, but we don't want it to collapse or go ballistic, just feel that it has so much nothing to lose that it can unleash everything. But again, the tension is very old. Even when under the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, right, Ukraine was, you know, we call them in shorthand that Ukraine was given security guarantees that Russia has violated. But in fact, when the diplomatic wrangling over the language of the Budapest Memorandum was happening, the lawyers in Washington, in the administration, were adamant that the word guarantees not be used, that there were assurances, because they understood that to give binding guarantees in this situation would commit them to an Article 5-like defense of Ukraine that they were not willing to underwrite and undertake then, and still this poses a major security challenge, right? The idea of a clash, a full-on clash with Russia, that challenge remains. Do we have any more questions? Yes, please.
First of all, thank you very much for the excellent panel. It was quite a show. I want to ask a question about statistics, and it's about the statistics you mentioned about support to Putin. How do you think this statistics relates to those people who already fled Russia? And I mean specifically those who fled the mobilization effort, not the ones that were that fled before? Thank you very much.
As far as I know, the survey of Russian field was made in the beginning of October, so the mobilization was announced, but they spoke to people online. So basically, there is a part of people who are in Russia and who are outside of Russia, and they're not showing us the number, the division. But this actually correlates with the other polls made by FCIOM or polls made by FOM who speak with people within Russian borders. So we can see that most part of Russians, well, Russians are contempt in politics. They don't like, they have a habit not to make politics, not to be political. So basically, I think that these numbers are correlate with the other numbers in Russia. So we have most part of Russians who will support any decision of the government, and if it will be peaceful decision, we will see more Russians supporting this.
I think we shouldn't exaggerate the scale of Russian immigration. It's very big in absolute numbers, but in terms of percentage of the Russian society, it's very small. And at the most, the estimates are maybe 1 million people has left Russia over this year, but it's less than 1% of the Russian population. It's a very small figure.
Yeah. I'd like to add also, to point out that Russia from Soviet times has a very deep tradition of allowing certain escape valves for public discontent. So even now, you have, with the mobilization, you have the most pro-Kremlin, the most rabid presenters on state television saying how bad these military guys are who allowed all these young untrained conscripts to be thrown into the meat grinder. We should have them all shot. We should have them all jailed. Right, so the Tsar is good and the boyars are bad. There's an old tradition of finding ways to let off steam without, but not one bad word about the party, kind of tradition. We had,
if I may, just a little point, which is absolutely correct, that this in relative terms less than 0.5% of the population, maybe for adult population, maybe 1%. So that is why it probably would not affect substantially the results that have been announced already. But it is there is one more very painful point. Some of the people who left, who fled Russia out because of mobilization, still have very imperialistic views. And many people who have been interviewed, let's say in Kazakhstan, after fleeing the mobilization, were not able to say directly who built Crimea, whom it does belong, whether it's Ukrainian or Russian. So that is why the problem of mindset and mentality and the culture court is a very serious and very deep, and it is not something that can be treated very easily in a very short period of time.
Absolutely. The young woman in the white. Mm-hmm. And then.
Hi, thank you. I'm Valentina Valjak. I'm actually representing Munich Security Conference here. We had a motto on our conference in February saying peace through dialogue. And this is just a comment and question to Mr. Ilarionov's saying that peace is only possible through destruction of the authoritarian regime. I just wanted to ask, what is with dialogue? Is dialogue here possible? Will Russia ever be opened for a dialogue?
Russia, definitely some part of Russia is open for dialogue, but we need to be very careful what kind of part of Russia. When we are dealing with a criminal, with a murder, with a person who is responsible for murdering of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, not only of citizens of other countries, but citizens of own country, who has demonstrated that he's just unable to keep his word. He violated all obligations, all promises that he has given for the last 22, 23 years. So he has signed a number of documents, including with Ukraine, including about the demarcation of the Russian-Ukrainian border, with Ukrainian presidents, and he violated those documents. He violated all those documents with Georgia, with all other, with many other places. So that is why the question is, when we have such a person or such people who violated and demonstrated their desire to violate tomorrow and day after tomorrow, what should we do with them?
Karsten, you had a question? Okay.
Thank you. My name is Karsten Friis. I'm from Oslo, Norway. Thank you for a great panel. I would like to just offer a little bit more optimistic view about Western support. Because after all, what Putin has managed is really to rally Western leaders together in a unity we haven't seen and not been able to do ourselves for many, many years. And we've seen over this period of the war, whenever the maybe the stamina has gone down and the support has seemed to be dwindling a little bit, something happens that wakes us up and oops, yeah, we have to get our act together again. So, I mean, it is the level of sanctions and the level of weapons is unique, really. And I'm quite convinced that we didn't throw all this weapon at Ukraine to make Ukraine lose or to give up. I'm quite sure Western powers will stay there, and especially the United States, with bipartisan support, will continue to support Ukraine as long as it takes, because there's no real alternative, because we all agree what the alternative is. So yeah, I want to throw out a bit more optimistic analysis to you and see what your response is. Thank you.
I would prefer to see Western leaders disunited, but to have all those Ukrainian kids who have been killed alive. West has enormous resources. The total military expenditure of those members of NATO, more than $1 trillion. NATO has provided Ukraine only one package of aid, which is 50 tons of fuel. That's all. That is why this statement that Russia is waging war against Ukraine is nonsense. NATO does not participate in this. Actually, it's one of the failures of this, as it has been announced, security organization for preserving peace and security in the Northern Atlantic area. It failed this task. So we have a very serious problem that the Western countries that are members of this great alliance have military expenditures of more than $1 trillion, and they supplied military aid to Ukraine that is bleeding under the Russian attack, only $15 billion over 8 months. Ukrainians are paying with their blood, with their death, with the lives of their people, because West does not provide necessary military aid that Ukraine is asking from the very beginning, even before that. Ukraine is asking for jets. The answer is no. Ukraine was asking for tanks. The answer is no. Ukraine was asking for missiles of longer range, 300 kilometers. The answer is no, still no. Ukraine was asking for all these long months, including the Ms. Zelensky, the wife of the president, for anti-missile and anti-equipment for Ukraine when she was speaking at the U.S. Congress back in, I believe, in July. Still, there is no single piece of anti-aircraft, anti-missile equipment from the United States has been delivered to Ukraine. So Ukraine is paying incredibly high price for the Western countries that have all those resources available. United States has thousands, tens of thousands of military equipment that's available today, now, yesterday. They're not provided. United States has provided 96,000 of trucks to Afghanistan army during this war. Compared to that, the United States provided only a few hundreds of Humvees to Ukraine. The United States provided more than 100 jets and helicopters to Afghan army. So far, US provided only 20 old Me helicopters, old Soviet helicopters. The United States did not provide any single tank. I can continue. So that is why the problem, once again, the lack of military support for Ukraine that is now became definitely one of the largest providers of security for Europe. It's donor of European security right now, Ukraine.
I hate to end on such a pessimistic note, but our time is up. I'm very sorry for those who weren't able to ask the question. And thank you once again to the organizers and to all of you attendees. Thank you for your patience. Coffee break is on.
Thank you. Okay.